Hello everyone and welcome back to our course. Coming up in this section, we are going to learn how to build a score system, starting with how to increase the player's score every time they kill an enemy. So join me back in our C++ solution. Here we're going to get started in our game mode header file. We need to create a variable to represent our player's score. And this can be a protected variable. So let's create this protected category, meaning that it can be accessed inside of this class and inside of any children. All right, next up, let's go ahead and declare our int score. And by default, it will have a value of 0. Next up, let's go ahead and build out a function inside of our game mode to increase the player's score. First, let's just declare it here inside of our game mode. We can make it public so other classes can access it. I'm going to make this just void and then call this increase score. All right, now let's implement that function inside of this corresponding C++ file. So I'm going to go into first person shooter game mode.cpp, and here I'm going to build the implementation for my increase score function. So this is void, it doesn't return anything. It comes from my first person shooter game mode, and we have to just add a here in front of that. And the function is called increase score. Then we have the body of the function. What we're going to do here is take the score variable that we just created and just increase it by 1. So here plus equals, that is how you can increase a value by 1. You can also write score equals score plus 1, but we have a shorthand there. Okay, and that is going to increase the score. Next, we have to actually call this function somewhere. So we're going to call this function every time our player successfully kills an enemy. So for that, let's hop into our enemy controller C++ file. Because we're going to be using functions from our game mode file, we have to make sure we include a reference to our game mode file. We can do that in the top here. We'll include our first person shooter game mode.h. And by including the header file, we'll also have access to all of the implemented functions in the corresponding C++ file. Okay, now we can access different functions like, for example, increase score. And we can access them inside of this enemy controller. So let's scroll down and find the location where we would want to increase the player's score. And that is inside of onOverlap. We'd want to increase the player's score if the enemy collides with or overlaps with a projectile, because that means one of our projectiles has hit the enemy. All right, so how do we increase the score? Well, first we have to grab our world and then grab our game mode and call the increase score function. So let's go ahead and call get world. All right, and here then I'm going to cast that to a game mode. So here let's just pass in a first person shooter game mode. All right, followed by here the asterisk. Next I'm going to then call here get auth game mode. So we're grabbing what is the game mode set in the game, which is going to be our custom game mode. And then after that, we're going to call its function, which is increase score. All right, so we're grabbing the game mode of the game and we're increasing the score of our player using that function, which we built inside of our game mode. And just like that, we can increase our player's score. How do we actually verify, though, that the score has indeed been increased? Well, for that, we're going to have to build some text on the screen. This will be a user interface that we can put on top of our screen, and it will display messages to our player, such as it will show them their score. It could also tell them when the game is over and prompt them to restart the game. Okay, so join me in our next lecture where we're going to build out the user interface for our game in C++. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our course. In this lecture, we're going to build out our score user interface using a combination of Unreal and C++. First off, we have to enable using our Slate user interface. So join me in Visual Studio or in your code editor, and we are going to open up our build file. All right, so that is going to be our C# file, which is your project name.build.cs. So some files are built with C#. All right, here we want to add UMG to our public dependency modules. All right, so here we have a list of all of the public dependency modules we're using. And we just want to add to this, just add the string UMG in all caps. Okay. Next, let's go ahead and also add a private dependency module. We need Slate and Slate Core, and those are for using Slate user interface. So I'll call private dependency module names, and I'm going to call the add range function. Here I'll pass in a new string, and those are going to be Slate and Slate Core. And don't forget the semicolon to end that line. All right, there we go. Next up, let's go into Unreal and let's create our actual object. We're going to create a C++ file for our game widget, as well as a blueprint with text for our game widget. So just pop open your Unreal project. Here I am in Unreal. I'm not in debug mode or anything. I'm just launched the Unreal project independently. First, let's create a new C++ class for our user widget. So I'm going to go into my content browser and go to C++ classes for my project. And I'm going to select add, and I'm going to add a new C++ class. Then for the parent class, I'm just going to go to all classes here, and I'm going to search for user widget. There we go, and that is the parent class we want for this object, because this is going to be a user interface object that shows the score on the screen at all times. Then press next and choose a name for your user widget. Let's call this our game widget. Make sure the path actually does exist, and then we can create class to make that header and C++ files. Note that you'll likely get a message that the project that is your game project has been modified, because we modified it outside of Unreal. You'll typically get this whenever you make a new file inside of Unreal and then you want to open up that project in Visual Studio. So just press reload all in order for all the projects to sync up. Before continuing, make sure that your Visual Studio project now has these two files, game widget C++ and game widget header. As well, your Unreal project should also now have this game widget C++ file appear. You may have to hit debug to compile your project one time in order for these changes to appear in Unreal. And you may also have to restart your Unreal project to see those changes appear. Okay, once we have this C++ class created, let's create a corresponding blueprint. So I'm going to go into my blueprints folder. I'm going to select add, and I'm going to add a new blueprint class. Then I'm going to search for my parent class in all classes. The parent class is going to be a game widget. All right, that is the name of the C++ file that we just created. So that will be our parent class because we're going to write some custom code. Then hit select, and that's going to create a blueprint. Let's call this BP underscore game widget because it's the blueprint that corresponds to our C++ file. Okay, then I'm going to save everything. And next up, let's open this game widget blueprint and let's give it a text component. Currently, game widget is actually itself a child of user widget. That's why you have this different look in your editor here, or your designer for this object. In this blueprint, this is for user interfaces, so I'm going to just drag a text object right onto the graph here. Then I'm going to increase the size of this text object. So let me go into details, find font, and let's change this font to something like 60. Okay, it may look small here, but you can test it in the game and you'll see it looks bigger. Okay, also let's change the contents of this text block. So we're just going to go into the text property here and change this to score. Let's give it a score starting off at 0. I'm also going to change the name of the text block. I'm going to call this my score text block. And I'm going to check this box is variable. That means we can edit this via our code. It's not a static piece of text. All right, let's compile and save this blueprint. Next up, we're going to write some code to enable our score widget here to actually update itself, because we don't want it to say score 0 all the time. So let's go ahead and pop open our Visual Studio solution. We can just close Unreal. Okay, and let's begin inside of GameWidget.h. Here in GameWidget.header, let's go ahead and declare our first functions that we'll need to dynamically change our score text. First, we're going to set the visibility of our functions. So make sure you're inside of the class body, and we'll make these public. So that way they can be accessed by other classes. I'm going to declare load, and also I'm going to declare set score, which is going to take in the player's score as an argument. All right, next, let's also declare a property score text, which represents the actual text itself. So I'm going to create this U property, and I'm going to specify here U text block score text. So this is a piece of text in the user interface. That's why we have that data type. All right, now let's also include several files that will allow us to write a bunch of user interface code. So let's go to the top here, and let's make sure we include some more lines. All right, so I'm going to first include UMG. So I'm going to include here from runtime/umg/public the umg.h. You don't want to just include the whole UMG folder, because then you would be having to load a lot. So then I'm going to include runtime/umg/public/umg style. So we could change these stylings. Followed by here include runtime/umg/public/slate. We want to be able to access the slate object widget. Followed by runtime/umg/public/iumg module.h. And one more here include runtime/umg/blueprint/user-widget.h. So we want to be able to use the user widget class. All right, next up, let's go ahead and implement our functions inside of our GameWidget C++ file. So we have to pop open that GameWidget.cpp. Here, let's define our load function. So it's void, it doesn't return anything. It comes from our class uGameWidget. So if you go into GameWidget, you'll actually be able to see that is the name of the class. It starts with a U instead of an A because it's part of user interface. Okay, and let's go back into GameWidget.cpp. Here we're then going to call load because that is what we are implementing. Here I'm going to create a constant f name, and I'm going to call this text block name. And here we're searching for the text block that we added in Unreal. So it's going to have the f name of text that says score text block, because that is what we named it back in Unreal just now. Alright, next we're going to check to see if score text is not null. In that case, we can set score text to contain the value of our text block name. So we're just using a way to grab whatever is on the Unreal side and bring it here. So we'll check if score text is equal to null, so meaning if it hasn't been initialized yet. And we can check that with null pointer. And we use double equal sign in order to do equality. So we're not assigning a value, but we're actually checking the value of score text. If it's null, it means it hasn't been initialized yet. So we want to take score text and set it to equal uText block, followed by here a widget tree. We're going to then call find widget. And the widget that we're looking for is the text block name. All right, that is going to grab for us our text block that we created, that we dragged in Unreal. All right, so that way we can have a reference to it via score text. As well, let's now define our second function, setScore. So I'm going to go below load, and I'm going to define another void function, again from uGameWidget, and this time it's setScore, and it takes in a score that it should use. All right, next let's check first if our score text is not equal to null. So this time we're checking the opposite of what we checked in load, because we can't set a score if our score text is null. We use the exclamation mark followed by an equal sign to check for not equality. So this if statement, its condition is going to pass as true if score text does not equal null pointer. So if score text does indeed have a value, we're going to grab it with score text, and we're going to use the function setText to change its contents. So we're just changing what's on the screen. We're going to use ftext and use its function fromString. Then we're going to create an f string out of the text of score. And then here we can just add an f string from int and pass in our score. That will be the easiest way of doing this. Okay, so we are taking just the text score, converting it to a string, and then into an ftext, formatted text, and we're adding a formatted string of our score, which is just an integer, but we have to convert this to a string. Some small changes we have to make are inside of our GameWidget header file. So we have to have inside of this header file, the generated include has to always be the last one. So just move this generated include to be at the end here. That is just the syntax that is required. Okay, as well, we have here our generated body. Should be fine. We have coming from the user interface. Okay, great. Now let's go ahead and hit debug and check to see if you have any error messages in the console here in the output, because if you do, it means you likely wrote your code slightly wrong. Perhaps you forgot a letter. So the output here will tell you if you have anything that you need to change in your code. If you get an error message on the generated body, it's likely because you put your generated line somewhere in between the includes, but it has to be the last line of the includes. So just make sure you put it as the last line and then close and reopen your Visual Studio project, because sometimes Visual Studio can take a bit of time to register your changes. If we want to actually now have our score text change, we have to tell our game mode to integrate that score text. So join me coming up in our next lecture. We're going to write code in our game mode to show the score text. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our course. Previously, we built out some code to set our score text, but if we want that code to actually be enabled in the game, we need to tell our game mode to actually change the widget. So join me in our game mode header file. First, we're going to declare a function that will change our menu widget. So let's make this public. I'm going to then hit enter here and create a new U function. This is going to be blueprint callable, and I'll create a category here, UMG game, so we can edit this in Unreal. I'm going to make it void and call it change menu widget. This is going to be T subclass of the U user widget class, and I'm going to call this new widget class. Next up, let's create a property that is going to store the widget that we're spawning. This one can be protected. So we're going to create U property. Just make sure we spell that right. Okay, and next, let's specify that we can edit it anywhere, so we could edit it in Unreal. It's going to be blueprint read only. And we're going to specify the category to be the same UMG game. Then we're going to set the T subclass. It will be a T subclass of the U user widget again, and we'll call this our starting widget class. As well, let's create a property to store the widget that is used. So I'm going to here create U property, and I'm going to set its type to be the U user widget and call this current widget. All right, now if we actually want to be able to use U user widget as a type, we do have to include it. So let's go to the top of our file here and make sure you're above generated because that has to be the last line. And we're going to add an include. We want to use blueprint/userWidget.h. All right, next let's implement our functions inside of our C++ file for the game mode. Inside of begin play, let's call change menu widget. So after the super line, which has to be first, we're going to call here change menu widget. And I'm passing in my starting widget class as the required argument. Then I'm going to call the load function on that current widget, which we declared in the header file. So I'm going to grab my current widget and cast it to a uGame widget. So let's just wrap these in parentheses and then add a cast. uGame widget is our custom child of the user widget. Then I'm going to call its load function. Okay, and let's see. Here, just make sure we have current widget, and we have to also enable our uGame widget to work. So let's go to the top of our file again, and let's add here another include line. Into the C++ file, I want to include gamewidget.h, our custom widget file. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to use this uGame widget. All right, next, inside of increase score, whenever the score is increased, we're also going to set the score text. So how do we set the score text? Well, first we have to get our current widget and then cast it to a uGame widget. And then we can call its function to set the score, which is just set score. And we have to pass in the score integer to use. Next, we also have to implement that change menu widget function. Remember, we declared that here in our header file. So we have to implement it as well inside of our corresponding C++ file. So let's go into our game mode C++ file and we will initialize that function. It's void and it comes from a first person shooter game mode, and it's called change menu widget. This is going to take in a T subclass of the user widget parent class, and it's going to be called new widget class. All right, then let's open up the body here of the function. Next up, let's fill in this body. We're going to first check if the widget is not null. We can remove it from the viewport. Otherwise, if it is null, we have to add it to the viewport. So I'm going to check here if my current widget, which refers to the widget being shown on the game right now, if that is not equal to null, that means we have the score text on the screen and we can remove it, because we're going to call change menu widget whenever we want to remove the score text and replace it. So I'm going to grab current widget and call the function remove from viewport. Then I'm going to set the current widget to be null. Okay, because we removed it from the viewport. Then let's also check if the new widget class is not equal to null. That means we have to create a widget and add it to the viewport. So I'm going to first create a widget by assigning it to current widget and using the function create widget of type user widget. Then I'm going to pass in here the world where I want to create it, and the type is going to be my user widget argument actually. So it's just going to be the new widget class. That is the widget I want to create. Then if my current widget now is not equal to null, I want to add it to the viewport. So if current widget is not equal to a null pointer, then I'm going to take the current widget and add it to the viewport, only if I was able to successfully create this widget. So what this function is going to do is it's going to remove the old widget and add a new one whenever we need to change our score text. Now let's go ahead and hit the debug button, and in Unreal we're going to have to change our game mode's game widget component, and then we'll be able to see our changes come into effect. Once you have compiled your code, you can then stop the debugger and you can just launch your Unreal project outside of the debug mode, because next we need to make some permanent changes on the Unreal side. So let's open up our blueprint for our game mode. That is blueprint underscore first person shooter game mode. Here you'll notice we now have this new property UMG game as this group, and the property is starting widget class. We're going to change this to be our blueprint for our game widget. Okay, then let's go ahead and compile and save this, and we can close up the blueprint. Next, let's go back into our map and let's hit play. And now look at that. In the top left-hand corner, we have our score. And every time I kill an enemy, my score is increasing by 1. Awesome. So we've been able to successfully change the score live via the game. One more thing I want to change is the range where the enemies are spawning, because currently sometimes they spawn a little too close to me. So inside of my Visual Studio project, I'm going to go into the game mode, and inside of the tick function, let's see, that's where we set the enemy timer. We could have them spawn a little more frequently, perhaps every 2 seconds there. And then we can also change their distance here. So I found that 10 can be a little too close. So let's set the minimum to be 100 here. Okay, and now if we want those changes to come into effect, we do have to recompile the code. Coming up next, now that we've been able to change our score, we're going to implement game over functionality, or what happens when the enemy touches our player Well, we should either lose health or we should just lose the level completely. And then we should have the option to restart the game, or we could restart the game automatically. There are many, many options. So join me in our next section. We'll implement the game over and restart functionality with C++.